Bless the Lord, oh my soul, worship his holy name.
All right, well, we appreciate you joining us for our Sunday night study this evening. And if you have a Bible, we're going to be looking at Matthew 18, 1 through 5. Matthew 18, 1 through 5, and we're just going to go through the text and make some observations for this evening's study. So if you don't mind, we'll just read the passage first, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Jesus is calling his people to. So in verse 1, Jesus begins, the story begins with Jesus, and the text says, "At that time, the disciples came up to Jesus, saying, 'Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' And he called a child and stood him before them, and he said, 'Truly I say to you, that unless you turn and become as children, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then will humble himself as this child, this is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me.'" And so if you think about the world that Jesus lived in, and if you think about the world that the apostles lived in, they were probably living in a world that people were always competing with one another. And they were probably seeing a lot of people put above others or put below others. They probably saw from day to day a Roman soldier asking someone to take his pack and probably humiliating that individual. Or they have seen rulers come in and make statements about how things are going to run in this area of the world. And they've probably read in the Old Testament how the Jews were always being put under bondage by other groups of people and always being submitted to foreign powers. And so they've lived a long time of people trying to claw their way to some form of power or some form of superiority. And I think that it's likely that even amongst the people of God, or here in Jesus' context with his disciples, I think that they wanted a little bit of a taste like that. I think that they wanted to feel like they were important. Maybe even because they understood the relationship that they had with Jesus, they felt a little bit superior than other people. And so maybe they're having this discussion with all of these things that they've seen around their lifetime or read about. They're starting to wonder, well, where do I fit into this world of competition, and where do I fit into all that? And so they ask Jesus a question that we're probably all familiar with, and they say, well, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And so if you think about the world they lived in, and you think about the Romans, or you think about maybe their local governor, that individual was great because he had a lot of money, or because he had a really good security detail, or because he had authority that was given to him by another individual. And because of that, they could acquire a lot of possessions, and they probably had a lot of influence with women that they wanted to be with, or they had a large military, excuse me. They had a lot of stuff, and they could lord that over other people because they felt important or they felt powerful. And so I think that it's possible that they wanted to hear something like, well, you're going to be powerful if you have, or you're going to be great if you have these things like they're used to seeing. Or you're going to be great if you have these things like the Romans have, because they saw that type of thing every day as the Romans were there. And so I think Jesus turns the table here, and I think Jesus says something that may have been a little shocking. And so he calls a little child and he stands them in the midst of them. So maybe they were in a crescent formation, or they were standing around Jesus as he was teaching them. And so he grabs a child from maybe a crowd, or maybe he borrows a child from his mom that in the marketplace or somewhere, and he just kind of stands there in the midst of their little group of disciples. And you could probably imagine maybe they almost laugh at Jesus, or they almost kind of make fun of the kid because, who is this child? Who is this 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old who is supposed to have this great influence with the community that Jesus has brought for all of the world that's going to be. They're going to be teaching the gospel for the whole world, and these are Jesus's right-hand guys, and you're saying that a child is supposed to compare to these 12 great guys who Jesus has handpicked? And so I think that they probably thought, well, that's kind of stupid. That's kind of dumb. Jesus, why would you stand a child here in front of us? Because children aren't educated, and they probably don't have a trade, or they probably don't know how to read the Hebrew Scriptures, or they don't have anything. They don't have any money. They don't have any they don't have anything. And so why would you have a child here standing before a bunch of people who know so much more than this child, or probably have families who they think that they're better than, or something along those lines, whatever you want to say. He brings this kid to them, and then he says, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become as one of these as a child or as children, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven." And if you look at some translations, there's actually an exclamation point there. And the reason why is because Jesus is being extremely emphatic. He uses a very emphatic construction here in the original language that's trying to say that you will never, ever, ever enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now notice what Jesus does here. They ask him a question about who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then he answers and he says, unless you can become a child, you won't even get to the gates of the kingdom of heaven. So I want you to think about, what if you got a letter from the university that you want to attend? And they said, if you don't have this GPA, you will never ever get into our institution. Or if you go to tryouts and the coach says, unless you do thus and so, you will never be on this team. Or if you have a relationship with someone and they give you an ultimatum that says, unless you do thus and so, I will break up with you. Jesus is being really emphatic here. And I think he's being very pointed here to say, this is what you're going to have to do. How much effort do you think you would bring to the table if your coach says, you have to do this or you'll be cut from our team? Or that university sends you that letter and says, you have to do this or we'll reject you. You would probably work pretty hard if it was for your education, or you would work pretty hard if it meant starting for the varsity basketball team, or you'd work pretty hard if it means that pretty girl would break up with you. And how important is the kingdom? How important is the kingdom to these disciples? How important is the kingdom to Jesus Christ? And so Jesus turns the table here and he says it's not about wealth and power. It's not about education. It's not about your trade. It's not about your family or any of those things that the first century really cared about. But it's about children. Now, that may sound a little esoteric, and that may sound like, well, what does he mean by that? Because children are uneducated and, annoying or something like that, and they may think that, well, Jesus gets real concrete about what he means by that in the next verse. And he says, whoever then will humble himself as this child. This is the greatest. This one is the greatest of the kingdom of heaven. And so again, they may see this child and think, this kid has no potential. This kid has no education. This kid he's nothing. But children, well, what do they bring to the table? Well, perhaps they bring creativity. Perhaps they bring ingenuity. Perhaps they bring problem-solving skills. But further than that, here we see evidently one has to humble himself to be a child. Do children bring humility? Do children bring a level of self-sacrifice? Or further, do children bring innocence? Do children bring to the table a faith that is passively trusting? I think all of those things are relevant. I think all of those things are true. So what does it mean to be a child? Well, I don't think that Jesus is saying here, oh, well, you have to be uneducated or you have to be less mature than another person. But think about all those things that children bring to the table that many of us adults struggle with, that many of us adults have issues with or may need to improve upon. It's those children, those small individuals that bring the greatest results. And it's funny because you see this comparison and this contrast of how small people are actually great. See, children are young in age and experience, but they're also just smaller than other people. And yet it's these little people, these smaller people, who are actually the greatest, the people who have the most potential in the kingdom of heaven. And then finally, Jesus makes a statement that I think is the most important that we should think about. After he makes a statement in verse 4 about the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, he makes this final statement regarding children, and he says, "And whoever would receive one child such as this in my name receives me." Do you see what Jesus is doing here? Do you see that how Jesus has led us to the point of not just saying, "Hey, children are really important. Be like a child." Children bring great opportunities and great attributes, so you should be like a child. Here Jesus is saying, if you receive a child, you receive me. And thus, if you receive me, you receive children. And I think the main point that he's trying to make is there's a lot of attributes that would qualify Jesus to look a lot like children. And if we take the opposite of that, there are a lot of attributes that children display that look a lot like Jesus. And if we're going to be like Jesus, we're going to have to transform ourselves into the image of children. And further, if we're ever going to meet the Lord, we're going to have to be like children. And the issue with that is the whole problem of humility. How many times are we sitting through service and we hear a child crying because it's a child, it's young? Or how many times do we see a kid running through the auditorium or down the hall and we think, "Oh, that's just so annoying." Or we think, "Oh, I wish that child wouldn't do that." But we also forget that all those children are innocent. And all of those children know how to trust their father. And all of those children are exactly what God made them to be. And here, not only are we saying that, hey, children add value, and children are important, and children are great, and God looks at children and appreciates children, but Jesus exemplified things that look like children. And so if we want to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and I would argue that perhaps the question that the disciples asked Jesus was a little misguided, because further down in chapter 20, he's going to say that the kingdoms of the world and the rulers of the world are trying to fight with one another to gain power, and it's not supposed to be like that, but we're supposed to be each other's servants. So maybe their question is a little misguided to begin with, but if we want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, or if we want to get there to begin with, we have to be a lot different than adults. And many of us are adults. We're going to have to learn to make ourselves lower and think about how children may live this life. We're going to have to think about how children trust their parents and how children are innocent, or how children bring skills and opportunities to the table that perhaps we don't. But I would encourage you not to just think about it because children are important, but because Christ was like a child. We see Christ in the temple at 11, 12 years old, helping with asking questions and answering questions with the greatest scholars of his day. Jesus, it seems, was doing some great things as a child. And I think that if we want to be pleasing to the Lord, we're going to have to look like Jesus. And that takes an extra measure of humility, and that takes an extra measure of thought on our part as we consider the fact that maybe we're not always as great as we think we are. And maybe we aren't always right. Maybe we aren't always as smart and as wise as we perhaps assume. But maybe next time you're in service, listening to the sermon or observing the Lord's Supper, and you see a child, maybe you can look at that child through the lens of your Lord. And maybe when we think about the Lord's Supper, or maybe when the invitation song is given, or maybe when we're listening in service and we think about the Lord, you can think about that child that's sitting next to you. Or you can think about maybe your relative or your niece or your nephew who's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, who's much younger than you. And how many times, most of the time, perhaps, Jesus would rather us be like that child than to be 22 years old like me, or 25 or 30, and assume that we always have everything put together, and to assume that we always are right, and to assume that maybe, well, I'm 30 years older than this child. That means I'm right. Or I have a degree, so that means I'm right. Or I have a job, and that means I'm right. These children, they have a lot less than we think, than we do perhaps, but perhaps they have a lot more to offer than we perhaps suspect. Matthew 18, 1 through 5 tells us a lot about what we need to be looking for in our lives. And it tells us a lot about the nature of Jesus Christ. And it's my hope that we would consider how to be more like him and how to please him as we're trying to conform to the way that he lived on this earth as he was trying to conform to the image of his Father. So I hope that we think about that this week, and I'm praying that we would consider that as we're living this life in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and all over the world. Thank you.